Welcome to Viewpoint on Ukraine Today. My name is Tamara Rosevan, and today I'm joined by Mr. David Quin, the Thomson Foundation Deputy Director for Development. Welcome to Viewpoint. You're here in Ukraine to set up a training program for local journalists, but the Thomson Foundation is usually known to set up programs in developing countries, in countries in Asia, in South Africa, and now you're here in Ukraine. Why is it important at this time to set up a training program for Ukrainian journalists here?
Well, you know, we've worked in Ukraine on and off for 20 years in a range of different programs. At this time, our longer-term focus over the next 18 months is working with regional media here in Ukraine, which is something that has generally not been often concentrated upon. A lot of media development efforts over the years have concentrated on working on national media here in Ukraine. Now, given the IDP situation and often times the hard pressures that are being brought to bear on civil society in general, particularly in the eastern oblasts, but across the country more broadly, regional media is the front line, if you like, in the information chain that affects everybody nationally, but particularly in those sensitive IDP-heavy regions. Now, that means that the regional media need to be able to cover those stories, cover the issues that matter in a way that is sensitive, in a way that encourages public discourse, in a way that is open and free. So that's why our concentration for this next 18 months on this particular project focuses in on regional media. You just mentioned the IDPs, internally displaced people. Is that an issue that you feel is not getting enough media coverage in Ukraine? In general, IDP coverage, wherever it is, reaches a peak reasonably quickly within any media environment. After which, the coverage declines very rapidly. It's a story that does not age well. This subsequently means, in the end, that the wider problems, the wider integration issues, the service supply issues, don't generally get much coverage. We've seen this over the years, in the 50-plus years that we've been in existence. We've seen this problem with media coverage of IDPs, of refugee scenarios, of migration problems more broadly in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, and indeed in the former Soviet Union. So it is the case that within a short space of time, it is a story that's often put on the back burner, put somewhat down the news agenda, understandably, but the sorts of societal pressures that are brought to bear by the large, huge IDP problems that we've come to see here in Ukraine, they're not going to go away anytime soon. And they need to be discussed both at a regional level and at a national level in order to provide sensible solutions. In order to be addressed as well. In order to be addressed, yeah. Before the interview, you were saying that you've been coming to Ukraine for dozens of years. And how do you think the Ukrainian media developed and over that time? And do you think the war in the east of the country, has it influenced media coverage here in Ukraine as well? I think in many ways the trajectory of the media scene here in Ukraine has... There was a blossoming certainly in the early period and leading up to the Orange Revolution and then beyond, after which I think there have been more restrictive practices, shall we say. There has been a decline, unquestionably, been a decline in the quality of, more broadly speaking, inclusive political dialogue within the Ukrainian media. I think it would be fair to say that the conflict in the East, as it has in other areas of civil life here in Ukraine, has injected a need within the Ukrainian media to open up debate more broadly. It's a massive issue that affects everybody's life one way or the other. It is not something that necessarily is going to be easily addressed through just partisan, rigid partisan media. I think quite a lot of media consumers, the general public, understand that, and they want a more diversified.
And now there's more of these kind of organizations which are created just by local citizens out to kind of report and what the local issues are.
Yeah. And we see that, in the rise of social media usage here in Ukraine has meant that getting those sort of very rigid partisan messages is only one part of the media space now, which, hitherto was not the case. So we're now seeing a much more diversified information flow, if you like, both in the regions and nationally, which is all, is a healthy thing. So, in essence, I guess we've seen a initial blossoming, somewhat of a more rigid period, and now a slightly more diffuse, fractured environment, which is, as I say, generally speaking, quite a healthy thing.
Now, the war in Ukraine has been dominating the headlines around the world, and what kind of lessons do you think can the media in general learn about how the coverage of the war in East Ukraine has been made in the West, here, and in Russia?
Ultimately, I mean, the coverage that we've certainly seen from Western media has, broadly speaking, has been somewhat restricted as a result of access in many ways. I mean, simple, basic questions of actually getting access into Crimea and the Donbass is proved highly problematic. So that is a first stage problem in combination with a news agenda which over the last 18 months has been incredibly intense in terms of regional crises, particularly obviously within Syria, but also within the EU itself, EU internal political problems, financial crisis, Greece, and now migration. So the coverage of Ukraine has a functional restriction in terms of access to the conflict zones, but it also has a restriction in terms of the amount of airtime and space available just because of the immediacy of other crises going on. So as with the IDP issue, it peaked and has now tailed off. That, again, is not necessarily giving the audience, particularly in Western Europe, a broad understanding that the conflict is still ongoing. So, it is something that, to a certain degree, needs to be reminded to Western audiences that the conflict is still ongoing.
Right. So what are some of the kind of wider implications of the media coverage of the war in East Ukraine? And do you think that the West has kind of cast it in a positive light? And how is it going to cover those implications later on now that, that the war in East Ukraine has kind of been forgotten in a way?
I think it's difficult to say whether or not the broad narrative in Western media of the Ukraine conflict has been too pro-Ukrainian, if you like. I think, generally speaking, most of the coverage has focused in on looking at the wider conflict as being a manifestation of a resurgent Russian foreign policy. That certainly has been part of the Western media narrative. That's the overarching conversation, if you like, that is ongoing. To that extent, what is taking place in Syria now has refocused attention back on Ukraine, insofar as it is being seen and is being discussed within the Western media that events vis-a-vis Syria do have an impact on what is going on here in Ukraine, and what is the interplay, what is the buy-out, what is the relationship between these two conflicts from Moscow's perspective. That is certainly forming a large part of the conversation in the Western media. Ultimately, I think that will also play part of the conversation will ultimately be about the Western response.
So thank you for joining me today in the studio. It was good to have you.
Likewise.
You've been watching Viewpoint on Ukraine Today. We've been joined by Mr. David Quin, the Deputy Director for Development at the Thomson Foundation. Thanks for watching.